Morning, everybody.
This meeting is being recorded.
All right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join us today and for joining us on time. The rule of thumb at the CIRT is that we start on time in respect of those persons who do make the time to do so. Today, I am shifting gears and changing hats, and so the job of moderation for this session will fall to Mr. Andrew Tomlinson, and I will just be a regular member of the panel. So, Mr. Tomlinson, if you're good to go, it's over to you.
All right, thank you for the introduction. Right, so, and I want to say, I am elated to have been invited to be a part of the panel discussion. A lot of the persons on the panel are persons that I would have heard of or known of in the industry. So it now gives me a chance to basically speak to these luminaries and see how best we can craft a way forward in terms of how do we manage this threat of ransomware. So for me personally, I wanted to start by saying there is no one that is off limits to ransomware. And the reason I'm saying that because during our course, more than likely, I will share some horror stories about my own journey with ransomware. So I just wanted to put it out there so we can have a level playing field and persons can actually learn from the actual event. So I would encourage persons to share any sort of incident. Obviously, you're going to not put the details out there, but we would want to be able to, at least persons here can learn, because that's how I've learned a lot in terms of learning from colleague and seeing what happens in the space and what to do and what not to do. So in terms of introduction of the panel, I'm not sure if, well, let me first start by giving apologies for Mr. John Gibson. He unfortunately had an emergency that started yesterday into this morning. He's still at it. So he wanted to be here, but I think we should be able to move forward with the discussions with the persons that we have available on panel. So let me ask. Hold for me. Godfrey, is it the introduction to the panel member? Should I just start with persons introducing themselves that are on the panel? How do you want to proceed?
Well, based on what was shared, the bios should be with you, and the running order was for you to do the introductions, invite persons on the panel to make either introductory comments with respect to the topic or to present a brief slideshow. And then we get into the questions. They were the areas that the questions should cover, and then we open it to the floor. So that
All right.
was what was shared.
Right. All right. Cool. No worries. So let me start going from left in terms of what was shared in the flyer. Rory Ebanks. Rory is coming from Symptai. If you had, and I'm just asking the panel members or the members of the discussion or persons in the meeting, if you had a chance to look at the bios, you would have seen that Rory is quite erudite. He has most, if not all, of the security certification. He has worked with Symptai for a while. I know Rory, and I've worked with him in the past. On the panel also, we have Mr. Rob Mayo Smith from Simply Secure. We've never met, but I know Kevin from Simply Secure, and they're doing big things in Jamaica in terms of cybersecurity. Job Gibson, who was supposed to be here, who inadvertently had an emergency and was unable to attend. His presence will be missed. We have Mr. Dwayne Brown from Jamaica Bankers Association. Dwayne and I know Dwayne, we met recently and we hit it off splendidly. And then we have Lieutenant Colonel Godfrey Sterling here on the panel. So I think we have lots of movers and shakers in the industry and persons that will be able to help us to move the discussion along and provide very good feedback in terms of how do we protect ourselves from ransomware. So I'm inviting, if any of the panel member wants to do a brief introduction or note, starting with Rory.
All right, sure. Hi, good morning again, everyone. And thank you for inviting me to this discussion. What I would start with is just giving a overview of ransomware. And I'm pretty sure we're going to have a lot of discussion around some of the incidents in our space and how we can protect ourselves and where the future is pertaining to ransomware. So ransomware, when you think about it, it's malicious software that locks you out of your data. So that's the basic idea of a ransomware. It's going to hold you at ransom, meaning it's going to ask you for some type of payment to gain back access to your data. However, the other coin to ransomware is that it also exfiltrates your data. So you have that perspective dealing with. So when you think about data leak or data breaches, then if a ransomware attacker gets into your space, encrypts your data, start doing lateral movement, and then they're also exfiltrating your data, meaning that they can either leak it on the dark web or they can also sell that information on the dark web. What's now becoming scary pertaining to ransomware is that not all ransomware attacks does encryption. You have certain ransomware groups that are just trying to get your data and then try to sell that data. So you have what's called initial access broker. And what they do is try to penetrate your network or users or employees and gain access to your information. They could either compromise a user credentials and then sell that credential to a target, and they can leverage that to then gain access to your data. You have different forms of data breach that could either stem from ransomware attacks. So you always think about ransomware as just a malware being loaded on a machine, but how did that malware get onto the machine? Could be through emails, social engineering, could be through a thumb drive placed in a bathroom, someone takes it up, plug it into your computer. Could be through zero-day exploits. It could be through application weakness. It could be through user vectors. So I can stay here speaking about all the different attack vectors, but that's a quick overview. And what we have also seen is a significant increase in successful ransomware attacks in the Caribbean, not only in Jamaica, but in the Caribbean. Literally every few weeks, we're seeing instances of organizations, different industries, government entities being attacked and their information is being leaked. So I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I guess I'll hand back over to you, Andrew.
All right, Rory, thank you for that. Rob, do you have anything to add to Rory's point?
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, from our perspective, my name's Rob. I'm CEO for both Symptai Secure, which does a lot of cybersecurity work in the Caribbean, and also T-Tech, which is predominantly Jamaica focused. And throughout Jamaica and other Caribbean entities, we've been involved in ransomware responses. And adding to what Rory says, that always it's a huge disruption to the businesses. For organizations relevant to the finance industry, like yourself, Andrew, we've seen organizations that have been hit from a banking perspective by ransomware, and the regulatory body in that country has stopped that bank from being able to interact with all the other banks in terms of credit card payments, ATM network, all that sort of stuff, until they could prove that they no longer had ransomware in the environment. And you can imagine things like that are a huge disruption to businesses when they get hit. So I'm looking forward to the conversation today. We've got lots of learnings that we've taken. We always do forensics when we support our, those businesses from recovering from ransomware, so that we can help teach them what they should put in place so it doesn't happen again. And there's some things that are always, very specific to that organization, but there's a lot of common similarities, and I'm hoping to share that with, everyone today. So, we can all take learnings from how the bad guys get away with stuff to make it easier for organizations to protect themselves from them. Thanks, Andrew.
All right, thank you. Dwayne, any points to add? Any notes here? Any takeaways?
Okay. All right. Morning, everybody. Honored to be a part of the panel here. And one little slight thing I want to add as well too. You see, because of the growth or the explosion of ransomware in recent times, I believe it has also pushed governments and legislative frameworks to be pushing us now into what I call the privacy era. So now, once your data has been exfiltrated, shared on the dark web and stuff, entities, enterprises, organizations also need to be mindful of the privacy implications, right? So that's all I wanted to add to the spin here.
Great point. Lieutenant Colonel Godfrey Sterling.
Thanks, Andrew. Good morning again to the members of the panel and those online. Well, the technical side is fairly covered. So what I will do is switch hats and put on the policy regulator perspective. What we're seeing, if we look at the threat landscape within Jamaica, is that the top ransomware groups continue to be quite prolific within our era. The top three really would be Lockbit 3.0, the Black Suit Group, and we're seeing a resurgence of BNLA. CLOP has had a fairly decent run in recent times as well. And so when we look at that, what we're seeing is that more than 70% of the responses that we've done over the last 12 months have been to cases where the point of entry has been through the use of compromised credentials, largely VPN credentials that had privileges on the network or the ability to get in the network with a fairly long dwell time and be able to escalate privileges while locking other administrator and privilege accounts out. What we're also seeing is that when we do respond, most entities don't have an incident response plan in place. Additionally, if they have a plan, it is dated, and the persons who are practicing currently don't sometimes know where it is or who is meant to perform what roles. within that plan. Additionally, the backups that exist, oftentimes where they do exist, they're on the same production setup, or they're on an always-on remote connection to the production setup. And what we've seen, particularly for the Black Suit group, is that once they find that you have either shadow copies or backups that are always on, they go there first and then come back into your production environment. We're also seeing that the managed security service providers, whether it is that they're tethered by non-disclosure agreements or they just do not wish to share, do not share lessons learned, do not share indicators of compromise, do not share indicators of attack or vectors of attack. And so what we find is that whereas certain attacks could be mitigated if the information was shared, or even if the incident was reported, the fact that it wasn't means that other entities in the same sector fall prey or become even more vulnerable to the same attack. And because the lessons learned are similarly not shared, then what others could do to harden their environments are left really to the theory sometimes. And that is something we have to change. As far as the legislative side, we have progressed down the road with the Cybersecurity Act, which will seek to fix some of those. We have also progressed with the completion of the National Cybersecurity Risk Assessment, which will seek to identify, codify, enumerate, and promulgate the national critical infrastructure landscape so that we can bring the obligations that will be part and parcel of the Cybersecurity Act into force. We have completed the National Critical Infrastructure Response Plan, the National Cybersecurity Standards Framework, and a number of other plans that will support that, including the National Cyber Incident Response Plan, which will bring a lot more governance and management to the cyber ecosystem, particularly for those entities within government that operate in cybersecurity, law enforcement, and cyber defense, so that what we have is redundancy and not necessarily duplication. The final point I would make under this aspect of it is that part and parcel of the Cybersecurity Act, as well as the National Critical Infrastructure Protection Plan, will be a certification process for managed security service providers who will interface with operators of national critical infrastructure, which is owned and operated by government or part-owned and operated by government. And hopefully the national framework for the voluntary disclosure of vulnerabilities and breaches will help us to work with critical infrastructure owners and operators that are in the private space so that we have that level of synergy to bring a more resilient cyber ecosystem to Jamaicans and Jamaica's national interests. So over to you, Andrew.
Thank you. So interesting points, and I had a small questions in relation to all of the legislative stuff that is actually happening. Is it because you're seeing that persons or entities or sectors are not necessarily applying the correct treatment to cybersecurity, where the state now has to step in to say, these are some of the prescriptive steps that you have to implement to at least have a semblance of security? Is that why we're going with the frameworks that you're actually talking about?
It's part and parcel, but it's not in reaction to it. Best practices is that there has to be that national framework. When we look at the Cybercrimes Act of 2015, even with the amendments that we did consequent on it being reviewed in 2021-22, there are situations that do not meet the threshold for a cybercrime, but still needs to be treated in a very structured and regulated way. There are regulators, for example, within our system that deals with utility companies, for example, that operate critical information infrastructure. And so what we are trying to do here is to create that legislative framework, that organized, structured response capability framework, so that persons understand what their roles are and how they respond in the case of a cyber incident that has national impact. Now, the CIRT itself really, even though because of the juvenile state of cybersecurity and incident response in Jamaica, and we respond to a lot of incidents that don't have national impact, our primary focus is really for those catastrophic incident that has impact as far as the national structures are concerned, critical infrastructure, the continuance of governance, etc. But what we will find is that we have to ensure that there are structures in place as far as incident response, the application of the work of managed security service providers, etc. So it can't be an unregulated space. We do not want to over-regulate the space, however. And so, for example, the framework for the voluntary disclosure of breaches and vulnerabilities is something that is there to allow persons to have the confidence that they're operating in a trusted environment with trusted partners. And so even if it's basic data that can be shared securely, all the way up to full-fledged actionable threat intelligence in a secure way with trusted partners. So it's not a reaction to what we're seeing. It is creating the enabling environment for how cybersecurity should be operationalized within the country.
All right, good, nice. All right, so let me switch gear a little bit. So I wanted to, as I said when we started, I don't think ransomware has any borders in terms of who it affects and how the industries are actually targeted by the bad actors. So interesting story. So about 2011, 2012, thereabout, I was working with an organization that had a director that traveled overseas, and he came back with ransomware. This is the first time I'm actually seeing ransomware. You know, I can interact with it. And I played around with the system that it was on, and I saw that this thing, okay, all right, the only way to really recover here is backup, to recover from a backup. Fast forward to now, where I've had colleagues in the space where they have backups. They do a 3-2-1 sort of backup, and the ransomware threat actors actually corrupted the backup mechanism and all of the backup disks that were actually used. So what I've seen is the space evolving to where the threat actors now are doing a more thorough job of destroying your data and leaving you in a state where you are not able to recover. So I just wanted to show what the distinction, the growth, probably it's a devolution of society where now things have actually gotten to the state where ransomware is so devastating now. Before it was easier to recover, but I think because of the bad actors putting in other mechanisms in place to prevent you from recovering, then it is much harder. So I wanted to, you know, any panel member can actually speak here in terms of, does the old prescriptive method of securing the enterprise still work, or do we need to think outside the box and employ new technologies? I would say, I don't know, Rory, do you have any thoughts on this? You know, do we still do backups and say that is it for us? Or do we think, I guess, less linearly?
All right, so that's a good question, and I think Godfrey touched on it earlier also, because what we're seeing in some of the attacks is that they're targeting the backup solutions first. So it could be VSS copy, it could be different type of backup solution, especially if we're doing backups locally. So a rule of thumb pertaining to best practice, don't back up your server and have the backup stored locally on that same server, because an attacker is going to target the backup environment. If they identify what technology you're using, they're either going to try and compromise that server or also ensure that the ransomware themselves are a part of that backup. Because we have seen cases where organizations are doing their backups routinely every day, and they're backing up the actual ransomware or the malware as a part of it. And when they go to do restoration, they're restoring the malware as a part of it. So even how you select how you select the backup solutions is also important. You want to ensure that it's doing scans, it's doing checks, just ensure that you're not backing up a version that has malware or has any malicious software as a part of it. You can also start thinking broadly in terms of what type of recovery solution are you going to have in place. Is it that you're going to doing backups to tapes, backup to drives, or are you going to start moving backups to the cloud? Are you going to start having real-time replication? Are you going to start thinking about users backing up their real-time documents to maybe the cloud, OneDrive? So you start thinking about different layers and how backups are done. You also want to ensure that the backups that you're utilizing is also encrypted themselves, meaning the organization is encrypting those backups. So even if an attacker gets in place and they target the backup servers, they can't destroy or disrupt the data that's there. Maybe they can delete it depending on the type of access that they have. But you also want to have different layers of protection. So you don't want to just stay flat and ensure that, okay, yes, I have backup, and you tick a box and say, yes, everything is good. You also need to test those backups routinely, because you don't want a case where there's an incident, you go for your backups and then you can't recover or restore. And it also plays a part in terms of what type of architecture are you setting up. So you did mention like traditionally backups are one of the first lines of response. However, you can go a step further in terms of even thinking about what type of antivirus or anti-malware solution are you utilizing. You have antivirus that can identify that a malware has occurred and do real-time restoration or rollback features. So again, the technology is out there. We just need to take advantage of it and leverage it and have proper defense in depth. So I know I've been just speaking about backups, but there's other layers of protection that you need to have in place to ensure that you can recover and you can respond in case there's an incident.
All right, good. Rob, would you say that this is the case that you've seen in the space, having given that you are doing managed security services, so you would have, I guess, the vantage point of seeing what's happening in the space?
Yeah, Andrew, definitely, just adding on to what Rory said, there's lots of good points there. And, the incident response work that we do, touch wood, is never for our clients, and I'll go into a couple of bits on that. But when we get called into an organization that's had ransomware, I've seen statistically that 52% of organizations, their backups get encrypted. But in practice throughout the Caribbean, we found it's much closer to 80%. It's actually very common that backups get encrypted. And the challenge generally is that backups are being, they're happening in real time. Just like Rory said, there are actually good backup solutions now, which they do two things, which I think, helps really protect organizations if they are hit by ransomware so that the backup is good. The first one is that they checks for ransomware malware as it's backing up. And if it sees it, it won't back up, sort of bad data over good data. The second one is you have incremental backups where they'll run every hour. And so it keeps the history for 10 days. And generally when organizations get hit by ransomware, they sort of know within 24 hours, 48 hours. And that gives them plenty of time to go back to an older version that'll help them recover. The second one, just touching on the antivirus one and your kind of question about what's up to date and what's not. And maybe I've actually got a slide that's quite useful if I'm okay to share my slide for a second.
Sure, go straight ahead.
I'm going to jump through to a slide on a deck that I have, guys. Give me a second. Is this coming up okay on the screens?
Yes. Probably want to go in slideshow.
How's that? Is that better?
Yes, much better.
So I'm just going to skip ahead to this one. And we always try to take learnings out of what we do. But the number one thing has always been when we get to this one. So the learning number one is that all organizations could have avoided ransomware if they replaced their traditional antivirus with a new age endpoint detection and response. And specifically what that means, these ones at the top are all examples of antivirus, which we've kind of grown up with and we thought we could trust. And so often, I meet people that have been hit by ransomware in the organization and they're trying to recover it. And they think they've got a very trustworthy antivirus. But the truth is the antivirus has not kept up with modern times. It doesn't have artificial intelligence in it. It doesn't have, the machine learning that some of the new age tools have. And so we've been to, we've been to incidents where clients had McAfee, they've had Norton, they've had AVG, we've had a lot with Symantec. Symantic's been around for a long time. It's popular in the Caribbean. And the truth is it doesn't stop most forms of advanced ransomware these days. We've also had examples of Windows Defender and Trellix, sort of some of the newer products that claim to be EDR, but really they're based on a traditional antivirus and not all the new functionality keeps up with some of the newer tools. So we always say to clients, move to something that is a really, strong endpoint detection and response tool. We often recommend SentinelOne because we find in the Caribbean it has the ability to be installed on older machines. SentinelOne has a legacy agent where really other strong EDR tools like CrowdStrike. We like CrowdStrike as well, and we do deploy CrowdStrike for clients as well. But CrowdStrike isn't so good when you're trying to get onto older Windows 7, Windows XP machines, where SentinelOne will work with them. And a lot of Caribbean organizations will have 2 or 3 old servers or old sort of desktops that are running some application that they need. And so we find that for that benefit, SentinelOne's really good in the Caribbean, and it's also pretty straightforward and easy sort of to sort of find your way through it, where there's a lot of configuration and tools like CrowdStrike, which are also very good. So, we have a lot of different learnings that I can, share if we have enough time today. But this is the number one in all situations. If the client had SentinelOne in the environment, it would have been fine. We have, we speak from sort of experience because as a managed service provider across our 2 businesses, we now have about 24,000 endpoints across 32 different countries that we protect with SentinelOne, and it's never let us down. I'm banging my desk at the moment, touch wood, it won't let us down. I know there's always the risk of zero-day attacks, but I've seen SentinelOne stop zero-day attacks with, where we found out afterwards that it was an advanced ransomware group that was doing the attack. SentinelOne stopped it. It's not recognized in VirusTotal, which is, saying, hey, is the hash recognized? So it's never been seen before. It's 0-day and it's been stopped. So, I know, like Rory said, it's important not just to rely on one tool. But what I would say for all organizations is if you've got limited budget, a tool like SentinelOne or CrowdStrike, if you want something different, they will really help make sure that you've got a very strong foundational layer to stop from ransomware. There's always, ways around it. We've been lucky that, we haven't seen it in our clients' environments. SentinelOne works really well. We use it for when we do incident response work because it contains the devices that it sees those threats coming from. And we do demos to clients as well where we release ransomware onto a server. As Rory talks about, it tries to copy, delete the shadow copy, etc., and encrypt it. And then SentinelOne keeps a copy of the original unencrypted shadow copy and it will replace it. So we can literally see files being encrypted. If SentinelOne's on the device, you can take it off. If SentinelOne's not on the device, you can't do it. Like, generally the way to recover from encryption is unfortunately you have to roll back. So that's a bit of a plug. But really I cannot emphasize enough the benefits of replacing a traditional antivirus with a new age EDR tool. That's kind of my message there, guys.
Okay.
So appreciate it, Andrew. Back to you.
All right, cool, great.
And
So,
sorry, Andrew. Before we proceed, also, I would just want to add on to that, Rob. So, great point about traditional endpoint protection and comparing it to new age EDR, so SentinelOne, CrowdStrike, Core. You have all these different solutions, but one of the key things that you also need to ensure is that it's configured appropriately. Because we have seen cases where organizations may have these tools in place, but if it's not configured appropriately, if you're not following best practices, if it's not continuously updated, then it's almost useless because
Yeah,
attackers can find ways around these technology and these tools. So a simple example, maybe you have it in place, but you're not enforcing certain rules to detect and to respond autonomously. Maybe it's just
yeah, very
sending you
true,
a
Louis. Yep,
notification, and then it's sending a
yep,
notification to someone that's not looking on the platform or the dashboard, or you only have one IT person in-house that needs to take an action, but they're off doing other activities. So it
yeah,
also goes hand in hand to ensure that, yes, we select the right tool, we select the right technology, we have the right persons in place, but it also needs to be configured appropriately.
yeah, totally agree, Louis. We've had examples where, when we come and we do the forensics, we can see that the clients had controlling, command botnets in the environment for over 6 months, doing all of that reconnaissance work that you were talking about. And, when we do the forensics, it's pretty clear in the firewall logs that that was happening, but no one was monitoring the firewall alerts, etc. No one picked it up, and that action wasn't taken. So it is really important, just like you say, that you don't just have tools, but you've got eyes on glass, people monitoring the environment, and that it's configured correctly. I've had other examples of where very, very advanced tools, very expensive tools have been in the environment, tools that I generally have, thought work really well, like Darktrace, and they haven't been configured. Darktrace can take autonomous defense. The client, to be fair, the client thought it was taking autonomous defense. They had a vendor that didn't support them properly on it. And the ransomware got into the organization at night. Darktrace alerted on it, but it wasn't taking autonomous action. And unfortunately, the client also had Trellix. Trellix didn't stop it. And so the ransomware got into the environment. So, just like you say, it's really important not just to have the tools, but that they're configured, that they're monitored correctly. Yeah.
All right, great points. And you said something earlier, Rob, which I wanted the panel to basically give some feedback on, which is outmoded operating systems and the fact that Sentinel-1 supports them. So I imagine that we're going to have all systems in the various environments. How do we protect those systems now, with the advanced persistent threats out there? Obviously, we'd want to get rid of these systems, but the reality is most organizations have outmoded operating systems there. What would you recommend that these organizations do? And I think Rory kind of touched on it with the layered sort of defense, but I would want to hear from the team here, what would be a good strategy to deal with those outmoded systems?
Yes, so just for me, very briefly, like I said, having a legacy antivirus agent that does work on it does help. Having segmentation of the network where possible, so that the older devices aren't exposed to the internet, they're locked down. Another one would be just actually having a plan in place where you sort of slowly but systematically go through some of your older devices and update the applications. Those would be some of the things that we'd recommend to clients, but I'll pass on to the panel for their comments as well.
All right, so I just wanted to come in here. So I think one of the things that we would need to go back to is risk assessment or risk-based strategy, right? So that's the first thing. In any enterprise, any organization, the possibility does exist, a strong possibility that you will have, I call them legacy systems. It could be a situation where the vendor has gone out of business, the company is still dependent on the application, etc. I think a process needs to be created whenever we identify that these machines are legacy, they're old, they create a risk to the organization, to the enterprise, because they are vulnerable, right? So now when a process is created where you assess the risk, you actually put that to the business to say, listen, this is the risk. If we leave this on the system, it's going to cause a problem. What are the mitigating strategies? Well, we could actually layer the defenses. We could isolate this machine from the network. We could install anti-malware on it to help to protect it. But at the end of the day, it needs to be clear to the business and to everyone, all the stakeholders, that at a certain point in time, we need to take this machine off the network, right? So I think it really starts with a risk-based assessment, bringing all the stakeholders together, being clear on what the strategies are, which decision will be taken, and also getting that machine off the network.
Great point. Great point.
Yeah, and as Dorian would have said, a lot of organizations will have legacy systems. As best as possible, try to replace them. If you can't replace it, then you have to have proper defense in depth. And we all touched on some of the points, but try and limit who can access that machine and how they can access it. So if even if it's segmented, I've seen cases where you have a legacy server, it's on a server subnet that's segmented. However, they still have a user group that everybody can remotely access that machine. That's not proper segmentation or proper access control in place. You may all want to start to have different layers in terms of how do you authenticate to that server? What can you identify on that server? You may even start tricking to say, okay, if an attacker is on the network and they're doing a scan on that subnet, will they identify that this is a 2003 server? So you can even start spoofing to say this server will identify as a different version. So those are some of the instances that you can try and trick persons or have proper defense in depth. Even in terms of segmentation, have multiple layers of segmentation from the firewall, the switches, ensuring that even the traffic that's communicating between that specific server or application, because in some instances, you may even want to move that machine completely off the network and host it somewhere else. So just in case there's some type of compromise, it's not impacting the entire network. So there's different approaches that you can take. But ideally, once you do that initial assessment, it could be a pen test, a risk-based assessment, a VIA, based on how important the system is. And when you calculate the risks, you would want to definitely try and move away from it. Because a perfect example, whenever we're doing a penetration test and we see a Windows 2003 server, majority of the time, it doesn't matter what layer of protection is on it, it's very easy for us to compromise that server and take it over. Even if you have antivirus on it, it's just simply vulnerable. And this is years ago. It's not supported, it's not patched. Even if you're having the antivirus on it, there are so many vulnerable processes that's a part of that operating system that it is still easy to get compromised. So you need to have those different defense in depth in place to ensure that we are adequately protecting it.
Okay, great. So it sounds to me like, Rory, you're saying not just segmentation, but we're probably looking at micro segmentation, having ACLs in place and having identity management in place to actually route traffic safely for those persons that need to get there. So there's a different layer. So you've gone a little bit more in depth in terms of not just isolating it in its own VLAN or subnet, but actually going a step further where not every system that's on even the segment can communicate. So you need to lock it down in that stead. All right, so great point. Godfrey, I don't know if you'd want to add anything to this point.
No, I believe the point has been well made. The fact is that oftentimes the boardroom doesn't know what their digital assets are. And so however you identify those assets, you just really need to ensure that the boardroom understand the dollar cost of keeping such resources online or not taking the appropriate measures to secure it. Not just bits and bytes and what vulnerabilities exist, but what it would mean to the profit of the organization, the reputation of the organization, particularly for government that provides really mainly services. And some of these ministries, departments, and agencies would fall into that category with legacy systems. And once you identify your digital assets, you're better able to target your resources, which will never be enough to secure the most vulnerable items on your network at any point in time.
All right, great point. I want to shift gears a little bit, guys, because I'm mindful that we might run out of time because there are so many topics to actually go through in ransomware, and I want to ensure that we touch on the most salient points. So another area that I would want us to speak on a little bit is, do we pay the ransom or don't we pay the ransom? That's a question. You know, my information is locked away and I need it urgently. Do I pay? What are my options? And I'm throwing this out to the panel so anybody can kind of jump in with a response here.
So I'll start, and I want to make it absolutely clear that when you consider the ethical and the prudential aspects of paying the ransom, it is a difficult call for any CEO who has been severely impacted by ransomware. As a matter of course, government entities will not pay the ransom because we're not going to finance criminality, right? And you don't want to build a reputation among your partners that you pay the ransom, you support criminality for groups that may be creating havoc in other countries. When we get down into the private entities, it becomes really a judgment call. And one really has to bear in mind that A, your data may never be returned to you in the state it was taken. B, you may never get the data back. C, the crypto you get may not work. E, the person might start doing multi-extortion methods on you once you agree to pay the first ransom. And I could go on and on, but what has to be taken into consideration is the impact on your business processes of the actual attack, whether or not your insurers or your incident responders are confident enough to say to you, well, this is the only option and you may want to take it. And then the question is, if you pay the ransom and you don't get your data back, where are you? And so the key to deciding whether or not you pay is to take the cybersecurity measures before you're impacted so that you have a reasonable chance of being able to recover even if the impact is totally devastating, as opposed to have to contemplate paying. So for government, ministries, departments, agencies, public bodies, the answer is just a straight no. For the private sector and the individual, it comes down to a judgment call, bearing in mind all the possibilities of having paid. You might just end up being an ATM machine for the ransomware group, or getting parts or pieces of your data or corrupted data back, or just not being able to recover the data. So from that standpoint, and it's a pity there isn't a law enforcement person on the panel, because that's a critical thing, whether or not you're now trending into committing a crime and all of that. But that's how we view it here. And certainly I throw it to the other members, because I will not pretend to tell a CEO of a $14 billion in asset company that is so severely impacted that the only thing to do is to pay the ransom that you shouldn't pay it. But it's an ethical question.
Noted. Rob?
I think from our perspective, we get asked that same question by the clients who've been hit by ransomware that we're helping through the incident response quite a bit. And we will always recommend that they don't pay for exactly the same reasons that, if we just outlined there, that you don't know for sure that you'll get the data back. And in most situations as well, I often find that the cyber criminals don't really understand the size of the business. They don't make it proportionate to understanding what is this organization likely to be able to afford. And often the ransomware that is charged is so high that even if the organization would actually consider, paying money to get back its data, it's too expensive that it can't afford it anyway. And in all situations, our clients have always taken our advice and they haven't paid. And I think, that's exactly the right step, because if you do pay, one, you're kind of setting yourself out as an organization that'll pay to get its data back. So you kind of a target potentially for other cyber criminals if it does get out on the dark web, that exists. And two, you're funding crime, and that's not anything we want. That just makes the problem exacerbate. So I'm fully aligned with, we always recommend to clients that they don't, but ultimately we tell them it's their decision, and they seem to make the right decisions, which is great.
Rory, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so similar views to all the other panelists. I don't recommend paying the ransom. However, there is a there's another angle that you can look on it, and I've seen instances in the US pertaining to this is they have cyber insurance in place and they can claim on the cyber insurance. So what I've seen, I think it was the Colonial Pipeline incident where they actually paid a ransom. However, they paid it because they were in discussion with either the CIA or the FBI, and they set up a task force to try and trace it to identify what group hit the ransom, what group or organization or country the ransom came from, and they were able to trace it and try to clamp down on that organization. But that didn't guarantee them getting back the data. It was just because they were trying to identify the source of the ransom and the company or the organization that initiated it. That's the only instance I would say you could consider paying it. However, if you're going to pay it to say that, hey, I must get back my data or I need to get back access to my system, there's no guarantee. Because Godfrey also mentioned it, you will start getting double ransom. So you pay, let's say that the fee is $100, and they say, okay, pay $100. You go ahead and pay the $100. They say, oh no, man, it's $150 now. So it's always going to be an extortion game. And even when you pay that money, there's no guarantee that you'll get back the data. There's no guarantee that even if you get back the data, it's your correct data. And even if you pay the ransom and you get back access to your data and your system, that information may already be in the dark web. So you may also be vulnerable to the data breach or the JDPA because there is now a data breach and a data leak. So you may also be fined 4% of your annual revenue from that perspective. So you're paying out money and then you're also going to be fined. So that's double payment plus the reputational damage. The ideal situation is you just have to be proactive. And even if there's a ransomware incident or a data breach, you need to have steps in place in terms of how are you going to respond. It shouldn't be a case where you got hit by a ransomware and this is the first time you're thinking about, okay, what should I use? Should I isolate the machine? Who should I call? Should I call the JSOR? What is their phone number? Who should I contact there? Can I contact Simply Secure? Can I contact Symptai? What's their phone number? Who is the person there? That you should be scrambling for items like that. You should have pre-planned it. You should have had your plan documented, the proper steps in place. You should have also had a tabletop exercise annually, at least to think about how can I respond in these instances. So it's always best to be proactive, and I do not recommend paying it. However, there have been instances. I haven't seen it in the Caribbean, but I know around the world there have instances where they pay the ransom and they start trying to chase it. But that's still no guarantee.
Okay, great. So I guess we have a quorum here. I'm waiting for Dwayne to weigh in to tell me if he has the same response to say if we have a full quorum in terms of not paying. Dwayne, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, man, definitely in agreement with everyone. It is a tough call, but there's only the one right call. You don't negotiate with criminals because you don't know what you're gonna get at the end of the day. You pay them and they still take your information and leak it. Right? You can't negotiate it. You can't negotiate with untrustworthy people.
All right. So I am, like I said, most persons in this space would have known me from, my journey in cybersecurity to where I'm at now in terms of the different roles that I've actually occupied. So I have a different take on what my options are in terms of managing systems. So yes, I'm in agreement with not paying, but what it means here is that, and the panelists basically touched on it, which is what is your fallback mechanism if you have a ransomware attack. So I don't think anybody who's on this call should ever think that it won't happen to me. So you have to be proactive in terms of a plan. And what I've gotten out of the discussion thus far is based on how these threat actors behave, it is more than likely that even your backup mechanism that you have in place, it has to be offline. It has to be in an area that you can't reach it, because I have a colleague that had a ransomware attack, and when they were trying to recover the data, The bad actors were on that segment and they were corrupting all of the disks that they were trying to recover the data from. So it tells me proactively, you're going to have a sterile area that you can recover your data. That's number one. You touched on the incident response plan. I think that is super important. You don't want to be scrambling when something happens. So obviously, it means if you rehearse the scenario enough, it becomes second nature. You know that you're going to make this call first. These are the things that you're going to do. I don't think when you have a ransomware attack, that's when you need to figure out, how do we disengage these servers? How do we turn off these servers or isolate these servers? I think it's much too late then. So proactivity is what I'm getting from the panelists here. Having a method to be able to recover, protecting your systems with the requisite security tools, doing microsegmentation, layering of your defenses. Those are also credible ways that you can put a buffer or at least slow down an attack if you are or when you're attacked. Because as I said, I don't think it's going to be if, but rather when. So an interesting discussion that I've had lately is in regards to AI tools and how this kind of filters over for good and bad. So cyber criminals are obviously using the AI tools, and back in the days, you would have we're talking about social engineering now. You'd have, how do you pick up an email that is perhaps crafted by a bad actor? You'd have bad spelling, you'd have phrasing that doesn't align. But now with AI tools, those things are not so easily identified. So how do we move forward in the era of AI tools being used by cyber criminals? What are our defensive capabilities? What are your recommendations in terms of how do we protect ourselves? So again, I throw this out to the panel. Any thoughts here?
Well,
I
I
think,
can, I can, I
oh,
can
sorry,
start.
go for it.
Oh, sorry. So you gave a good example of how AI tools can be leveraged with phishing exercise, social engineering. But that's just the initial state, because what we're seeing now is that AI tools are being used not only for crafting emails. So for example, whenever we're doing a social engineering campaign for our clients, we may take a message from a CEO in a company and then say to simple example, ChatGPT, write a message to the organization, letting it sound like it's coming from a top five company as a CEO, and they will craft the message, no grammatical spelling. Then you start using AI to get the email signature to ensure that it looks the same. However, there's a step further than that, because what we're seeing now is that AI is being leveraged to even do vision exercises, meaning voice cloning. It's also being used to do deep fake attacks. And that's pretty much having video and audio to think that, hey, this is actually Rory Banks having a conversation with you when it's not. And that's just AI being leveraged to tweak how you communicate. And there has been instance, I think, in China, where deepfake was utilized to do a bank transfer of $25 million because the bank manager thought they were having a communication with the CEO through a video call. So that's just the entry level of how attackers are utilizing AI. It's even a little more simpler, where if they want to find vulnerabilities, you do have botnets out there. You do have continuous tools that are identifying weaknesses and vulnerabilities in Jamaica, in the Caribbean, in different countries. It's just by simply clicking a button, filtering, and say, hey, show me all of the open RDP sessions in Jamaica. And they can then start launching an attack against it. So that's using AI to attack. However, you can also use AI from a defensive perspective in terms of leveraging the technology to make decisions, to identify risk vectors, to correlate all of the different types of logs that you may have, the different types of notifications, taking that autonomous response vector instead of depending on only persons to make that decision. AI is now responding or being your first level of response. Remember, you're not going to be manning an environment maybe 24/7. Maybe Simply Secure would have their team because that's their primary job. But as a IT person, you may not be there 24/7. They will know that, hey, on the weekend, on a Saturday, you're not going to be around the machine, so you would not see a notification if they launch an attack. So you can literally utilize AI to be that first line of defense in terms of responding and even recovering. And there's other types of technology that you can leverage. So you're thinking about regular antivirus, but you have XDR, EDRs, forensics tools that you can ensure that are on your machine. So just in case there's a breach, you can forensically investigate what happened, what transpired, what data did they have access to, what processes were being leveraged. So it's sifting through all of that information utilizing AI. When you compare forensics that we used to do like 5 years ago, manually going through all of these logs, it's going to take weeks for us to try and identify this information. While utilizing AI, it's just a keyword. You just type in keywords, finding the processes, and it's starting to correlate everything. You're starting to see, okay, it came on this subnet. Okay, what other machine can we correlate the information with? So that's kind of how you can leverage some of the technology utilizing AI.
Okay. Rob?
So, Andrew, I think just adding on to what Rory said, we've talked about the sort of the benefits of having things like tabletop exercises and making sure there's an incident response plan in place. Generally, I find that only quite mature organizations have them, but incident response plans will let touch wood, if you've got a good playbook, you already know if you have a serious incident like ransomware, where information has been told to you by the cyber criminal, they're going to make it public, that you want to get on the front foot. You want to have, your PR team already involved, and they might have already tailored some draft press releases about, that you've had a breach potentially, that you're working through it, that you've engaged professional services, that you take it very seriously, that your customers' data is, your top priority, etc. And so just going through those tabletop exercises are very useful. I think, we talked a little bit about layers of defense as well. And, I'm a big advocate, as I said, for replacing traditional antivirus with EDR. But some of the other really good tools, automated patching in place. So often those vulnerabilities from older devices, etc., when they get real old, they can't be patched, but the majority of devices can be patched, the operating system, the third-party applications. And then the next one we generally say is email, and particularly email that has artificial intelligence protection in it, where it's smart enough to tell if that email comes from someone that looks and it sounds exactly like the CEO, but there's one digit different in the domain. It will tell, because it knows there's no relationship between that sender and your company before, and it will know that. It'll quarantine it. It takes it out of the inbox. Security awareness training is obviously very important. In the Caribbean, we see a huge amount of people downloading things from the internet, trying to get free versions to keep costs low, or to not have to go through their IT team. Or sometimes it's the IT guys as well, downloading, say, free versions of Adobe, or, sometimes free versions of IT support tools. But the problem is they often have, they're called hack tools, which create backdoors, which allow cyber criminal groups that often use them, particularly the Russian ones, to get in and cause trouble. And we've seen that in our incident response work, where organizations have been quite liberal about what they let their staff download and put into the environment. So security awareness trainings are, a really important one to sort of stop it from happening in the first place. After that, we talk about things like zero trust, which means that if someone does download a program, it's not approved, it won't run. That if someone doesn't have the approval to get into specific servers, they won't. So if their credentials are stolen, there's limited damage they can do. And then we get into things like for more mature businesses, things like network detection and response, like SIEM, with the SOC kind of running over the top of it, etc. Most organizations obviously have firewalls these days, but people work from home. And so, having multi-factor authentication on a lot of your tools also helps. And so all of these together go that if, someone has their credentials stolen through a phishing attack, that there's different protection in place that will limit the damage that can be done by that, or ideally it doesn't happen in the first place. So that's how you stop it from happening in the first place. If it does happen, the number one thing you want to do is contain the threat. So, making sure that if you're clear about what devices they are, that you take them off the network or you power them down so the damage is limited and it won't spread to other devices. Once you've contained the threat, obviously you try to make sure that the rest of your devices are protected. So if you need to keep your rest of your devices on to make sure that the business is operating, if you can take them off and you've got more time to deal with it, fantastic. But if you can't, you make sure you get a good tool that will stop the ransomware from spreading. The general one, which I spoke about before, is generally a very good tool for doing that. And then once you've stopped, you've stopped the threat from spreading further into the environment, then you start doing your forensics, trying to understand how did it get in, where did we let ourselves down, what do we do to make sure that it won't happen again. And then you start thinking about rebuilding the environment, bringing it back on safely so that it won't spread, which devices need to be rebuilt from scratch, do you have backups that can work, so on and so forth. And slowly you bring the network back on. And that process, I talked through it quickly, but that process generally, if you have all hands on deck, can be real quick, can be 3 or 4 days, but in most cases it'll take a couple of weeks.
Okay, great.
That's it, Andrew. Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to ask the two panelists that haven't spoken yet. I want to give some time for question and answer. So I will allow Dwayne to kind of give his insights on how do we manage now in terms of with AI tools being introduced for offense, what are our defensive capabilities or options that we have?
All right, thanks for that. So, I think with the advent of AI, as the guys had mentioned before, the panelists, it really helps with the correlation of data and identification of threats. It really assists us with sieving through data and raising alerts, right? So AI is really technology that helps to make the work, the sifting, the analysis a lot quicker, right? We see that in a number of technologies, including antivirus or anti-malware tools and various other things. But one of the things that we haven't mentioned before as well is that we need to also be mindful of our enterprise or the network, because it's no longer a traditional network. So now we've expanded to work from home, as Robert mentioned, and we also have expansion to the cloud. So the traditional approach wouldn't be sufficient. So again, we would need to be doing continuous vulnerability assessments, checking our network, looking objectively to see where are the potential weak points. And with AI and stuff, it can help us with actually identifying some pain points really quickly so we can get to a decision. Also, as it relates to social engineering and security awareness, where we had actually mentioned that as well, where AI tools can be helped to assist us with crafting phishing emails and stuff that we can test our staff with, so that we can better test our environment. All of this is actually proactive, where we're actually trying to test our environment to see where the weak points are so that we can be in a better position to defend. They also mentioned the incident response in terms of tabletop and actually going through potential hacking or security incident type situation so that on the day we're not scrambling, right? All of those things I believe are very important to create a very strong security posture so that we're in a good position if and when we are faced with this threat.
Great point. Godfrey, I know. So I wanted to frame this in the context of policy building and how does our policy encapsulate, like, does it speak to what sort of tooling that we can use, or is it just administrative? Is there like a technical component to the policy?
Thanks, Andrew. So the technical side, the policy side of it, there isn't yet a policy. What we have is a national task force on AI, which has just recently completed their initial assessment of our situation and submitted their report. That report is now public. What will come from it is the necessary policy and strategies to drive those recommendations. However, while the technical aspects of the use of AI and the implications have been covered by the other three panelists, one of the things that we're seeing is the way in which prompts are entered into generative AI platforms by organization and the fact that they're inadvertently leaking data in putting some of these prompts in order to get results, to get a leg up on the workload that they have. And that is a bit of a challenge. Additionally, what we're seeing is that there is no organizational policy in using these generative AI models and platforms, and that is also creating some concern for us, as the data that is being used to generate the results on some of these platforms, and not just ChatGPT, which is quite popular, but others that generate slide decks, etc. We're seeing some challenges here, as some of these platforms have been compromised and data belonging to entities in Jamaica have been seen on the compromised data sets that resulted. So these are some of the challenges we're seeing. So what the recommendation here is to ensure that, similar to the introduction of any resource into your environment, you have some sort of policy that governs it and that enough care is taken. That only the persons who really need to be using these platforms should be using them, particularly with company data, to generate responses from these platforms.
Great. All right. So I'm in agreement with the feedback of the team. AI in particular has been an area of interest, and what I've been looking at is running it on-prem, because most of these models you can actually run them on-prem. So one of the takeaways from the discussion is, because there's really no strategy, or if you don't have a strategy around how AI tools are going to be used, it's something that I guess we need to look into. Inadvertently putting company data into these tools mean that you've actually now allowed the world to actually see what's there. So we have to be very mindful and careful of how we use these tools. And again, I think there has to be a policy surrounding how these tools are used. So each organization has to do their risk assessment, because these tools are becoming a reality. They are now integrated even into your devices, your mobile devices. So it means you can't necessarily decouple yourself from the tools. They're actually going to be baked into the various tools. If it's not into your processor, in terms of the number of taps that the processor can do, or the smart devices that you have. So there's no way to really escape. So I guess it is for the persons on the call to now be mindful and also take the requisite steps to ensure that their data is actually protected. At this point, we have 13 minutes. I would want to, I'm pretty sure, given the panelists here, they're burning questions that would want to be posed. So I'm going to allow for questions to actually be asked. You can do so by raising your hand, and I will allow you to ask your questions. Hopefully we can get you as many as possible. Not seen any questions so far.
All right,
All right, guys.
I have a question, man.
All right, go, Rory.
So Godfrey, I'm very interested about well, we call it responsible disclosure in terms of identifying vulnerabilities and reporting it. What would be the next step? So, for example, if we're on the dark web, typically we would identify potential information. It could be a breach credentials or potential discussion of launching an attack. What would be the next step if that is reported? Or even if we're browsing an application, we find a vulnerability, would we report it directly to the CIRT or would we report it to the organization?
Thanks for that, Rory. There are two ways that we recommend this is dealt with. If you're constricted by non-disclosure or the legal impediment, then you disclose it directly to the entity in a way that if it's not an entity that you're contracted to, they can appreciate the gravity of the situation and treat with it. And you share a redacted pseudonymized, anonymized version with us. So we're able to maintain that holistic picture of the national ecosystem. Additionally, if you can't identify who it belongs to or you don't want to take that on, send it to us. We will anonymize, pseudonymize, or otherwise sanitize it if you haven't done so, and we will reach out. So we do what we call vulnerability notification. We're doing the same sort of tasks. We identify vulnerabilities for entities and we reach out, we identify a point of contact. We then ensure that we can confirm that that point of contact works with the organization and has the authority to see the data that we're going to share. We then do secure sharing with the entity of the vulnerability that we're seeing. We treat breaches a little differently because we don't want to really name and shame people, but the same process is followed. However, the sharing of that breach data is a lot more involved in terms of who gets it and what the recommendation is to deal with it. The only challenge we have is where the data that we're looking at resolves to an ISP. And then it's bringing the ISP in a confidential sort of discussion to see whether or not they would be willing to share who the third-party subscriber is, or we can sanitize the data enough to share with them for them to share with the third-party subscriber. We have made some progress. For example, with one of the subscriber, their parent company, we have a SOC-to-SOC arrangement. And what we've seen in the last 12, 15 months is almost a 90% reduction in the number of vulnerabilities on that ASN for the ASNs for that service provider. With the others, it's a little bit different because some of them lawyer up, and that really doesn't help us. And others we're just bringing into the fold. So for you, if you find it and you can share with the entity, then we ask you to do that and share a sanitized version with us so we can maintain the picture. And if you can't, we will take it on, we will sanitize it and share as best we can. Next steps after that is really to have a formal MOU, ISA, that we can do this Symptai to CIRT without even involving the third parties initially, sort of thing.
All right, good.
All right, thanks.
So I have one question, one hand up here. I'm going to allow this person from Computer Live Support. Not sure who the person is. So once I unmute, you can identify yourself and pose your question, please.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Hi, this is Hope, Bertland Hope. So I was asking, I wanted to speak about four things, Wazoo, Greylog, Nmap, and HMail server. So Wazoo is a open source theme that it will do the threat analysis for you and suggest preventative measures that it could take. Greylog is a log aggregation platform. It can aggregate logs from different sources. And then you can do similar to what you do with the smart AI tools. You could create patterns to analyze different activities and then send notifications to a distribution group. And you can have an on-prem HMail server that would do the mail relay between those things. So you won't even have to come outside of your network. And then you could also use Nmap to the regular scans of your local network and your public-facing IPs to get an idea of what vulnerabilities exist or what vulnerabilities would be visible to threat actors out there. That's from the hardware side. So that's not taking it from the software, the human aspect. So that's not taking it from the social engineering part. This is taking it from the hardware part, what server they have, what vulnerabilities are on these servers and the IPs that are visible to the public. Some of the tools that you could use, because I didn't hear anyone mention any open source tools, so I just brought these up. Wazoo is open source, Greylog is open source, and I think HMail, you don't have to pay for it, and it runs on Windows. The simple mail server that so you can have that mail relay between your notifications from Wazoo and Greylog to your distribution group that would be in your Outlook also.
That's great.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for that. I hope the persons on the call are taking note. You know, I don't want to get started on open source persons who know me know I am an open source person from day one. I'm a Linux advocate. So if you want to go open source, but I think for this discussion, some of the points that were made by the panelists touch on some sort of automation. So I would say use these tools, but if you can also have some automation done, because I think Rory touched on the point that if you're looking at 24/7 times 365, if on the weekend you're attacked, even though you have the tools, you may not get to look at the information or the alerts in a timely manner. So I would say you have to stack up on your open source tools plus your proprietary tools to kind of tie all of that together. So it's a combination for me. I don't know if any of the other panelists have any views on, integrating open source into the environment, because I use a lot of those tools myself.
I think you just want to make sure when you use open source that you get it from from a credible source, and ideally that you run it through VirusTotal. Just because I've seen so many IT teams thinking they're getting something useful open source to help them out, and it's not the legitimate product that they were expecting, and they get hidden malware inside. I just put that as a caution, guys. But otherwise it's great if you can make open source tools work for you.
Right. I have another question here. OG, not sure what that stands for. Floor is open.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Excellent questions, excellent responses. I am Orion Gray, hence OG. I'm an IT consultant. My question is there any partnership between government and the service providers to mitigate cybersecurity at that layer? We talk a lot about layered security, but we have to think about the external layers, like, the service providers. And is there any cultural initiative that is positioned to address the cultural, the risk-taking culture that we have, especially in IT, right? I've seen a lot of IT professionals take risk by troubleshooting and testing software that is not legitimate, right? Or they might think they can go to a site and download a movie, and these are IT professionals. We have this inherent risk-taking culture that you see it on the roads every day, right? I know it's high level, but I think as a nation, we need to put these things on the table and see how we can address them. So that's like two questions in one. I don't know who can respond to those.
All right, so I'll take it from the policy standpoint. So, we talk about the Charter of Rights and we talk about inalienable rights, and the right to a safe internet access or safe internet access is something that is almost as sacrosanct as those inalienable human rights. And one of the challenges you face is not wanting to seem to be censoring content. There is that. So sensitization and awareness is how we combat that, hoping to really drive that cultural shift from persons who are really taking unnecessary risks to those who will become more responsible and utilize the internet in more savory ways. The challenge you face with the service providers is that as of now, there is no law requiring them to. And as such, they're not obligated. So where you can implement an MOU or an information sharing agreement, and you can get responsible corporate behavior from some, there are others who are just about the bottom line. It's about making that buck. And you will see sometimes they see the traffic, that they are aware of what it is. And rather than alert their clients, they will try to sell a service to prevent those who can afford it from falling victim, whereas everybody else are at the mercy of what they're seeing. So there is a plan to deal with that, and that is going to come out of the Cybersecurity Act and the national plans that will be implemented as part of the National Cybersecurity Strategy. However, there is the responsibility of each and every individual who must take cybersecurity, their own personal cybersecurity, as a personal responsibility. And if we bring that culture of responsible behavior into any organization, then the culture of the organization will shift towards one that is security-centric. And if we do that across all the public and private sector entities that we have, then we'll have a nation where the layers are inherent, from the individual to the body corporate to government as a facilitator and regulator, and the security in depth will be achieved almost without even thinking about it, and resilience will be accrued from that. So there are challenges, Mr. Gray. However, we recognize these, and we can't just do it in one fell swoop. We have to take it stage by stage. We have to have the consultations. We have to have the buy-in. We have to ensure that people appreciate the challenges, the difficulties, the cost of not behaving responsibly in cyberspace.
And I just want to add on to that too. So I can speak to one specific service provider, which is Digital. I know they have a product where if you purchase their DIA, I guess this goes for organizations, then you can purchase secure connectivity. And that's bundling some penetration test, vulnerability assessment, endpoint protection along with DIA. So for example, you would have your internet connection going to your firewall, or that's tied to a website. At a minimum, a security scanner assessment would be done for that. However, from a policy perspective, that can't be something that's rolled out to everybody. It's pretty much a subscription model. But that would be a start to ensure that at least they're monitoring, or they're doing some proactive approaches to ensure that the ISP or the IP that's provided to you as the end user, at least there's some level of security scans and vulnerability assessments that's done with it.
All right, Rory, thanks for that.
Yeah, I would just add as well, guys, that Cable and Wireless also takes cybersecurity very seriously, and they have a program around trying to help their clients around security. And I go, gee, the biggest challenge is just that there's so many cyber criminals that are always trying to get out there. Just in terms of the new email domains that are created for phishing, that just happens all the time, and new websites pop up all the time as well that are nasty, and it's very difficult for even the organizations that specialize in locking this down from a cybersecurity perspective to keep up. And that's a lot why the artificial intelligence sort of helps in the scenario. The one other thing I'd say between the private and public sector, and the sort of things that CIRT do, and I recently last week had a conversation with CIRT as well, and talking to them about the sort of things that we've spoken about, that we see that happen to our clients and that they see happen to their clients. They're very, very similar. The only thing I would say, CIRT said they see a lot of corporate espionage, not corporate espionage, sorry, government espionage within the government sector in Trinidad, where people, from they've got external countries as nation states trying to, watch what they're doing, etc. But aside from that, the type of things that we see that would allow cyber criminals into the environment and incidents and that sort of thing, we're very similar. I think it's such an open landscape that, just like Godfrey say, unless you're dictatorial about what people can access, it's and even if you are, it's still actually difficult to police it.
All right, great point.
Sorry, with you.
All right, so we've run out of time. I'm going to take one more question, and in the chat, I'm going to actually paste some recommended steps that we can actually look at. So Rashid, going to allow you to ask your question.
Hi, morning everyone. So, quick question. So, we see more organization as they move to cloud-based infrastructure. How does this change the nature of ransomware attacks? And is it that we're seeing new vulnerabilities in cloud environments being exploited by these ransomware actors? Or is it that cloud migration is offering more protection?
Very good question.
Very good
Rory?
question, Rashid. Yeah, I'll take this one. Good question, Rashid. So what we're seeing, and there has been an increase in terms of the amount of misconfiguration when it comes down to cloud. So compared 2022 to 2023, we saw a 95% increase in cloud attacks and cloud misconfigurations leading to exposures. It doesn't necessarily mean that a ransomware may take over the cloud instances. However, they're not prone to an attack. And we have also seen instances where like a OneDrive may be impacted by a ransomware and that locks your data out. What attackers are doing now is targeting cloud instances based on it may be account weaknesses, so authentication weaknesses, compromising that level of access, and then pivoting from if you have a hybrid approach where you're syncing from cloud to on-prem or on-prem to cloud, then that's a vector that they can get into your environment. We have been on engagements where we have penetrated the on-prem Active Directory server, and because there's a sync up to the cloud, we're able to gain access to the cloud servers and also the cloud accounts. So you have to think about it. Yes, the landscape is getting broader, but not necessarily only from a ransomware perspective, but there's other attack vectors, other weaknesses and vulnerabilities that are now existing because of this nature of how the environments are syncing or configuring. And even applications that are SaaS-based completely in the cloud, we have seen vulnerabilities of these applications themselves. So it doesn't mean that just because you go to the cloud, you're going to forget about security weaknesses or security vulnerabilities. They still have to get tested. We still have to ensure that they're following the proper controls. They have a framework in place. Even the cloud instances themselves can get hit by ransomware because if you take a platform as a service in the cloud and a ransomware has hit that server, it's the same steps that you need to take to recover it. It's just that it's hosted elsewhere, not on your on-prem.
All right, great response. So what you're saying, in essence, Rory, is that the cloud is not necessarily a fix all for the issues that we have. You still have to have the necessary steps surrounding the technology. So it's basically porting those controls that you have or that you should have to the cloud as well, because it's now a global external platform that is accessible by the not just the person that hosts the data or the provider, but the world on a whole. So you kind of put in your stuff on somebody else's system behind their firewalls. So I agree. So it's all about having the requisite controls in place, doing your proper risk assessment, and also to see what technologies these cloud providers provide to you in terms of being able to detect if encryption is happening, if you are encrypted at rest by default, those sort of things. So I don't think it's a case where you can just port your data and think that you are now safe from ransomware. So there's some amount of forethought that goes into it as well. All right, I'm going to ask Godfrey to basically close out if there are no more questions. Godfrey.
Thank you, Andrew. Am I closing out in terms of my closing comments or in response to the question Mr. Walters asked?
I would say both.
Well,
that's a good setup. That's a good setup. That's a good setup.
There isn't much to add to what was said. You know, when we think about the cloud, there are two schools of thought and two lines of effort that I really sort of push. For the individual and the body corporate, it's your choice. It is what you do. Unless you're operating national critical infrastructure, then we sort of take an interest in what you're doing. For government, there are certain ministries, departments, and agencies that we have listed as being critical to the continuance of governance that we don't recommend for cloud services at all, save and except for backup. So you really need to have your services on-prem or in a secure government facility, and then you have a cold backup, if you may, elsewhere. And there are 7 such ministries with about 35 departments and agencies. And those are the ones that we really sort of focus on. The challenge is that a lot of IT professionals, when they recommend the cloud, think it's a fire and forget situation. And so they recommend the cloud, management pays for it, they do the connection and they forget it. Cloud usage is a shared responsibility, especially security. And your tenants on the same platform often determines how critical security has to be for you, as well as where your data is and that sort of thing. So I wouldn't get into that. As far as combating ransomware, the biggest challenge that we face here at the CIRT is low or no reporting from the victims, from the service providers who respond. That's not us. And from the standpoint of law enforcement investigation. So yes, law enforcement gets involved, but oftentimes I find that our brothers in law enforcement does not follow through to the point where they can participate in the lessons learned. And so oftentimes the victims wonder, well, what was the purpose of reporting it to law enforcement? We have to change that. And it has to get to the point where, notwithstanding that a lot of the actors are outside of Jamaica, the levels of cooperation that exist now with like Interpol, the FBI, Europol, and other jurisdictions outside of the Western Hemisphere, we can follow through on these. We're small and we might not get a shot at prosecuting these people, but certainly our voice must still be heard in terms of these actors have breached the system in our jurisdiction. We have identified them without fear of repudiation, and we want to ensure that we're part and parcel of what is happening there. And I believe if we can follow through on that and communicate that to Jamaicans generally, then we will get probably a better turnaround in terms of the victims reporting it, the private or MSSPs that respond, saying to these people, at least there needs to be notification. It shouldn't be only as a condition of your cyber insurance that you call or write to us to say, we have suffered a breach and this is the nature of it and we have contracted somebody. We have to get to the point where we view this as joined up. Everybody suffers when any significant entity suffers a ransomware attack. And so if we view it as, and the financial sector is really one of my biggest challenges. And, you know, we try to work with them, but boy, it's difficult. But we really have to get to the point where we can have a trusted platform, a trusted group of persons that we can share sanitized data and threat intelligence to the point where we can actually build the resilience that we're trying to find.
Okay, good. All right, so I know we've run over time by what, 12 minutes, and the persons that are still on, I'm thankful. I've actually pasted a document in the chat. It's not ransomware, guys. You can trust the source of this one. So it's just 20 steps to perhaps help you to harden your system, so you can just go through and tick off the line items or the curated items there. This is obviously not going to solve your problem, but we have to start by starting. So thanks for the persons on the panels for actually feeling the discussions. Thanks to the person that actually attended, and for Godfrey who put this together and to make this actual concerted forum where we could have come together and actually know what the government is doing versus us as individuals not being able to share our experiences. So I'm thankful for this opportunity to have been a part of this discussion, and I hope that this is not the last of it. So we need to have further discussion, and each one help one. So persons, my email address is there, and I think Godfrey would want, well, I guess most person here would want to, if they have any additional questions, I think Godfrey is more than willing to field those questions and provide directives and information as needed. So again, guys, thank you for attending, and have an excellent rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Have a safe one. And for those of you who can join us tomorrow for Cybersecurity Awareness Day, it's free. And it will be a day chock full of good information. So come out and join us. We're at the Caribbean Military Academy in Upper Camp. and the invitations are out, so you can come and see us. All right.
All right.
All right, guys,
Thank you
have a
all.
good one.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank